fire. So, the book of Judges has a bad reputation. In fact, it seems to be the worst of what many people consider to be several rather nasty Old Testament books. Along with the book of Joshua, Judges is the book that people seem to have in mind when they say things like, let's not study the Old Testament. It's so full of violence and war and killing. Or, I just don't like the Old Testament. God is so wrathful, so vengeful. I like New Testament God better. He's warm and fuzzy. Or, how about, how could God tell the Israelites to kill the Canaanites and all those other people? Jesus told us to love our enemies, not to kill them. So on, so on. Overall, the book of Judges is tale after tale of persistent disobedience by the people of God that causes progressively worse and worse consequences. The book of Judges tells the story of a tribal people of God, the Israelites, after their time in the wilderness with Moses and after their leadership by Joshua. They were not yet a fully formed nation. They were more like groups of men and women working together in small family units, in clans or tribes, in order to eke out a living in the hill countries of Canaan, on the margins of the territories that were actually still controlled by much more powerful Canaanite city-states. Joshua makes it sound like the people of God have just moved in and wiped everyone out and took the land for themselves, but that's actually not quite accurate. It's far more accurate to point out that the people of God were actually occupying less favorable areas where no one else wanted to live. For example, the hills, because it was difficult to farm there. What is true is that they moved in among the Canaanites and other people living in the land, everyone that had "ite" at the end of their name, Hittites and Jebusites and such, moved in among them and married them, had children with them, and here's where the problem lies, started worshiping their gods and their idols. The Israelites quickly adopted Canaanite ways of life, practiced their religion and devotion. And one of the religious practices was child sacrifice. That was a bit of an issue. In short order, it became impossible to tell an Israelite from a Canaanite. And the problem with that is that the Israelites were a people descendant from the covenant with Abraham, the promise with God to be a blessing to the nations, a light. They had lost their light. They had lost their saltiness. The book of Judges, taken as a whole, recounts 8 cycles of this descent into broken sinfulness and idolatry. The first step in this, you have to think of it like a wheel. The first step is the people falling away from God. In so doing, they would lose God's protection, and nature essentially would take care of itself, with the people falling victim to their enemies. The people would cry out to God, and God would then answer them by raising up a local hero or a judge who would start to set things right, usually involving some kind of bloodshed and war. Finally, there would be peace, and faithfulness to God would be restored, at least for a few years, until the judge died, at which point the people would backslide and the whole pattern would start over again. 8 times, with the cycle getting progressively worse and worse. Given its bad reputation, one might legitimately ask why we should even consider studying this, writing about it, teaching it, and preaching it. I've been listening to Connie ask me why for about 6 weeks now. She plans on reminding me of this in about 3 weeks when I'm crying in my office. Don't we have enough violence nowadays on television and at the movies and in the news? Why do we need more of it at church? Isn't it bad enough that all that horrible stuff is even in the Bible to start with? Do we have to make it worse by drawing attention to it? Wouldn't the best policy be to just ignore it? Well, the answer to that last question in most ecclesiastical circles seems to be yes. Consider that the book of Judges appears once in the 3-year preaching lectionary cycle, the Revised Common Lectionary that's used by denominations around the world. It appears once in 3 years. Also, it gets no time and attention in our hymnal. You cannot find a hymn about the judges. I looked, I tried. I was going to have us sing it all night long. In short, the book of Judges seems to be an embarrassment, actually, to most church folk, and perhaps it's best passed over in silence. Now, I think I have oppositional defiant disorder, because this automatically makes me want to do the thing that we shouldn't do. So I'm willing to go out on a limb and propose that the book of Judges might actually be the most timely and relevant of all the books in the Old Testament for us today. Here's why. Consider this list of features. Tension and strife between rival groups. Disputes over land and territory. Uncertainty over the roles of men and women. Power-hungry political leaders. Child abuse. Spousal abuse. Senseless and excessive violence. Male political leaders who chase after women. Excessive individualism, moral confusion, and social chaos. Doesn't this sound like a summary of our newspaper from this morning? It sure could be. Rather, what it is a key list of themes in the book of Judges. Themes which solidify the significant parallels between then and now. While it's true that the world has obviously changed dramatically in the past 3,000 years or so, and while human civilization has come a long way, the book of Judges is a timely and sobering reminder of how far we have not come. While we are included, or while we would like to think about the above issues and problems, primarily in psychological, sociological, anthropological, or political terms, the book of Judges is an invitation to also think about ourselves and our world and its troubles in theological terms. From the outset of the book of Judges, we are urged to confront the challenging claim that nothing will be right with our individual selves, our families, our churches, our world, unless we, the people of God, manifest steadfast loyalty to God alone. In short, unless we are faithful to the covenant between God and ourselves. So the book of Judges is a warning, a prophetic warning. But the warning is grounded in hope. For not only did Israel experience the destructive results of its own disloyalty and its own disobedience, it also, in equal measure or more so, experienced a God who was unfailingly faithful to a faithless people. The book of Judges is interpreted as a tale of persistent disobedience of the covenant people and the equally persistent attachment of God to covenant loyalty and grace. Thus, Judges perhaps ought to be considered the most prophetic book for our time. These two simultaneous realities, warning and hope, judgment and grace, mess and mercy, beg to be studied and taught and proclaimed together, as much in the contemporary church and the world as they were in ancient Israel. Lent is the perfect opportunity to reflect on who we are and to repent. Not to be miserable. Nobody's asking us to be miserable, but to acknowledge our need to change. Acknowledge the way that we fail God, the ways we fail to keep the covenant. And the good news for us is the same as it was for Israel. God is faithful. We are a messy people, but we serve a merciful God. God who desires to be known in the world through God's sometimes very messy people. Welcome to the season of Lent and our series, on the book of Judges. To God be all the glory.